Кошмар издевательств на Олимпиаде теперь во многом остался для нее где-то далеко позади.
The International Olympic Committee seems to have invited Russian and Belarusian sports to come out of isolation. They want to see them at the 2024 Olympic Games in Paris, however, in a neutral status and not in full force. Participation conditions are varied. The already familiar close attention of WADA and increased control. Full compliance with the Olympic Charter, and in particular the peacekeeping mission of the IOC. This means that only those who did not actively support the fighting can compete. Individual checks for all entered athletes with immediate exclusion, as soon as the conditions are no longer met. These ideas are absolutely revolutionary. There has never been anything like it in the entire history of the Olympic movement. Athletes have never been required to publicly withdraw their support for their state's policies. Even when this policy was unequivocally condemned at the world level, for example, the apartheid regime in South Africa or international sanctions against Yugoslavia in 1991-1995. What will Russia's return to the international arena look like now? And will it take place at all, or will the political conditions of the IOC prove unfeasible? Here are the main questions and answers. Which of them are correct, we will find out soon. The first persons of the Russian sport met the recommendations of the IOC without enthusiasm. ROC President Stanislav Pozdniakov believes that this is a step forward, 2 steps back. This statement is an attempt to correct a mistake that has already resulted in groundless restrictions for Russian and Belarusian sports for almost a year, and has caused great damage to all international sports. The voice of common sense was heard. However, we still categorically disagree with any restrictions, additional requirements and sanctions that relate to the nationality of our athletes, and are again being offered to us as a condition for returning to the international arena. And here is the Minister of Sports Oleg Matitsyn. We consider it inadmissible to determine special conditions for participation for athletes that do not comply with the Olympic Charter, the principles of equality and justice. No politics can and should not interfere with sports. There is no place for speculation about this special military operation. But important words also appeared from the second person in the ROC, an assistant to the president of Russia Igor Levitin. Judging by them, the Russian side is at least ready for negotiations and compromises. As soon as the international federations receive recommendations from the IOC, they will inform us and we will begin work. But I think it's a success. The Olympic community understands that the Olympic Games cannot take place without Russia. Following the recommendations of the IOC, each international federation will form its own criteria for the admission of these guys from Russia. They will definitely be in the spirit of the IOC, that is, anti-doping and policy requirements will remain. But the specifics may differ depending on the type. In the situation with the exclusion of Russia, the federations worked very quickly. The entire process of creating an iron curtain, from the recommendation of the IOC to a total ban in almost all forms, took several days. Recovery is usually much more difficult. In theory, these guys could even make it to the Biathlon World Championship, starts on February 6, and certainly to the Ski World Championship, starts on February 22. But the recommendations of the IOC are about participation in the Summer Olympic Games in Paris. There, the main qualifying competitions in most sports start only in April or later. That is, summer federations can take their time and calmly discuss the criteria with their Russian colleagues. Question: will the winter roads come up with something urgently to save, for example, the Russian-Norwegian confrontation in skiing? The most subtle point in the decision of the IOC. Thomas Bach said back in September that athletes who distance themselves from the actions of the authorities should be allowed under a neutral flag. But what exactly do the IOC and IFs mean by lack of active support? Let's say, will social networks and old interviews be checked? Will participation in rallies and receptions with state leaders be considered active support? What about military athletes who play for CSKA and have military ranks? Is it necessary to sign certain declarations as a condition for participation in competitions? Something similar was tried in March by the International Motorsport Federation. Then the majority of Russian athletes refused to sign political statements. The Olympic Council of Asia has already offered Russians and Belarusians participation in the Asian Games. In many sports, this fundamentally changes the picture of Olympic selection. Quotas for Paris 2024 are divided by continent, and if these guys leave Europe for Asia, then we make room for someone, while others, on the contrary, are taken away. So far, there is no specifics on this issue, and it is not clear who is interested in this. For example, will they be happy to see Russian synchronized swimmers at the Asian Championships, who are guaranteed to take one quota from local teams? And the Russian divers, on the contrary, in case of not getting into the top 12 at the World Championships, this is an automatic qualification. They will have to fight for victory in the continental tournament with the remaining Chinese. The task is more difficult than winning the European Championship. Back at the end of February, the IOC explained the very first measures by concern for the safety of Russian athletes, emphatically not calling them sanctions. At the same time, the Norwegian Ski Association did not allow Russian skiers to start the World Cup, also in the framework of fears for their safety. Theoretically, the organizers of international competitions, which are included in the official calendar and especially influence the Olympic selection, do not have the right to choose whether to invite this or that country or not. Undertook to hold competitions organize access to them for all participants. Competitions are the property of the International Federation, and not of the host country. Exceptions are commercial tournaments like the Diamond League Series in athletics or the Tennis Grand Slam. For example, at the Olympic Games 80 in Moscow, people from countries with which the USSR did not have diplomatic relations at that time performed. Representatives of the boycotted countries had the opportunity to come under the flag of their Olympic Committee. And the opposite story. Soviet athletes were invited and went to the 1988 Games in Seoul, although the USSR recognized South Korea and established diplomatic relations only 2 years later. A boycott by other participants is possible. Such examples also occurred. For many years, representatives of Armenia and Azerbaijan, Israel and Arab countries did not go against each other. Such a story is not encouraged, and even threatens with sanctions at official tournaments. Obviously, it won't be like before. It won't work for months to hold training camps in southern countries with a suitable climate, to travel non-stop to international competitions, and plan a sports life for reasons of how convenient, and not how it goes. The countries of the Schengen Agreement issue visas to Russians with great difficulty and strictly for the terms of the invitation, and not for several years, as before. Many countries no longer have direct flights. Russian bank cards and transfers do not work, and the Ministry of Sports still has to solve the difficult task of how to pay for tickets and hotels now. But in general, these problems, especially in comparison with all the others, look rather fundamentally new, but solvable. In Pyeongchang 2018, the IOC has already come up with a solution by calling these guys Olympic athletes from Russia. This allowed the rescue of hockey and teams relays in individual events, for example, a team tournament in figure skating. All of them performed under the flag of the ROC. This time, the IOC recommendations state that athletes in no way can represent the state or any organization within their country. It turns out that the option with the OKR flag disappears. But with all the neutrality, these athletes and teams will have to be named somehow. Neutral status means that the athlete represents himself at the competition, and not the country. The country also has no right to forbid him to start. But this is in theory, but in practice the state has a lot of options for influencing. Especially where the athletes are fully supported by the state in terms of salaries, fees, coaching fees. If someone is ready to give up all this and still participate in international competitions, we will definitely see such people at the Olympics, regardless of the final decision of the ROC and the Ministry of Sports.